So on to serotonin. And so I think this should make sense that you're just marking whether it's a yes or no or neutral. And then we're just kind of looking at kind of a general way of gauging this as if there's 3 or more in one column. Then at the bottom, you just kind of circle where you think you're at there. So serotonin, so we had, okay, so norepinephrine was the upper, GABA was the downer, and serotonin is kind of the in the middle chemical, I guess I'd call it. The centered one. So when people have a good level of serotonin, they're not really up and they're not really down. They're just sort of in this nice groove in the center of things. So it really is the balanced chemical. And it shows up when someone's low in serotonin, they tend to crave carbohydrates and comfort foods. And so those are things that stimulate the serotonin to release. And a lot of this happens in the gut. There's most of that serotonin is produced in the digestive tract. And so the carbohydrates and comfort foods are tied to that digestive process. And you can also be low in serotonin and take antidepressants. And so if they respond well to antidepressants, that's a good sign that they are low in serotonin. Just for information, antidepressants that are commonly used now are SSRIs, and that stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So what that's doing in the brain is it's preventing chemicals from being recycled back into the cell. So one cell will send it out, and then it'll hang out in the synapse, and that's where you experience the chemistry. And then it'll get picked up by the next cell. And so if there's excess chemicals in the synapse, you have a high, or you have this sense of plenty. But when there's not any excess chemicals in the synapse, sometimes you feel like a lack. There's a lack of those. And so serotonin is typically, if there's too much, for the next cell to pick it up, it'll go back and recycle back into the previous cell. But what the reuptake inhibitor does is it prevents that reuptake. It prevents it from being recycled back. So it hangs out in the synapse longer. So it doesn't give you more serotonin. And so sometimes what I'll suggest to people is that they try taking 5-HTP. 5-HTP is the metabolite of serotonin. So it stands for 5-hydroxytryptophan. And it's basically the building block for serotonin. And it gives you more of the serotonin. So when you have the building blocks for it, you may not have to worry about whether or not you're going to have more of it, I guess, to work with. So back to the list, I am moody and overwhelmed much of the time. So that's the sense when someone's low in serotonin, usually they're feeling mood swings and really overwhelmed. So that feeling of overwhelmed is, I've seen, very connected to serotonin. More so than just anxiety. It's a little different than anxiety. So usually that's part of that process. And then, I wish I felt more stable and balanced. So just like we talked about, this is the balanced chemical and could be the key in finding that. So if you're low, then if you're high in serotonin, or if you have a little too much, what you'll see is contentment, a lot of contentment. And so a person could just sit around, do idle activities, watch TV, read, socialize. That looks a little different than too much GABA, because what I see in this is there's a lot more activity going on with the serotonin than with, someone who's just really high in GABA and does nothing. But it's not task oriented necessarily. It's not high energy things. It's just kind of sitting around. So this term couch potato, I think it's funny because I got a book called Potatoes, Not Prozac, and the chemistry in, or the amino acids in potatoes actually support serotonin. So I think that's so funny that we've gotten that term couch potato, and it totally fits this. So yeah, serotonin and potatoes go together. So I just think that's funny. Carrying extra pounds is part of that, because if you look at somebody who's really idle, just kind of sits around a lot, and they tend to munch on things, tend to have trouble losing weight, and it just kind of accumulates. And then easygoing personalities fit with this too. They're usually pleasant. And so when you have a lot of serotonin, you're quite pleasant and you're just easygoing, kind of unaffected by things. And so they're great personalities to be around. They're good team players. And so if you look at the function, people who have higher levels of serotonin, have that personality, are great on a team because they're right there ready to help out, but they're not the leaders. You don't want to ask them to be a leader because that's just not in their nature. So there's the serotonin characteristics. And so you want to look at where you're at with that. And then we'll go on to beta endorphins. So beta endorphins are related to sugar. So in this book, Potatoes Not Prozac. So the author relates the difference between serotonin and beta endorphins, and from that, there's also another consideration, and that is where sugar fits for that person. So anyway, I thought it was interesting. I made all those connections when I read that book. And there is a difference between the chemistry that craves carbohydrates and the chemistry that craves sugar. And there is a difference between how serotonin feels and how beta endorphins feel. So beta endorphins do tie in with that inner morphine, is what, if you look at the word endo, it stands for inner. And orphan, if you add an E on there, would be your morphine. It's a narcotic-like chemical. The problem with that is to try to raise that chemistry. If you're low in it, the only thing really to do that with is addictive. Just as addictive as I talked about with the benzodiazepines are narcotics. Narcotics even probably could be more addictive for people that are low in them, especially. So these are things like codeine and Percocet, and OxyContin is a strong one. It also can run all the way to heroin. And it's really scary how people who start on some of these prescribed pain relievers I've seen a lot of cases where people end up going out to get illegal narcotics just because they develop that tolerance and it's so addictive. But here's the crazy thing is that most of us are using a narcotic every day, and it's in the form of sugar. And if you've ever tried to go off of sugar completely, you experience withdrawals. And I did this last summer, and I was getting sugar out of my system. And I assumed they call it a die-off syndrome when you're trying to kill candida and you're trying to, get all of that stuff out of your system. But what I realized is it was just sugar withdrawals. So the die-off symptoms and sugar withdrawals are basically the same thing. But the sugar withdrawals, I would end up, at least for a full day, just basically in bed. Just not wanting to do life and knowing it will pass because I've done it before. But it's very miserable, I will say. So that's what that's important to, I think, look at. When people are low in beta endorphins, they tend to be agitated and feel too much pain. And so when they get hurt, it's just, they react more. And emotional pain, I think, is the one that you also run into, is that they're just very sensitive, or they're very reactive, I guess, to things that are emotionally difficult. So that's that piece. And C, I long for romance and intimacy. So romance and intimacy are stimulants for, or stimulate that beta endorphins release. They mimic beta endorphins to some extent. But I wish I felt more loved is in there. Love is the one thing that may resolve this and not have the downside of addiction. So if you find the right type of love. So what I found is when you're in a beta endorphin deficiency, looking for love through romance and through other people doesn't work very well. It becomes an addictive pattern, and you end up in addictive relationships, or you end up going through a roller coaster with it. And what does work is divine love and more, I guess, pure types of love, like someone who has an unconditional loving relationship. So that solution I talk about at the very end of the book, and I will talk about at the very end of the series of classes, and there's a solution there. So that's important to know. If you're low in beta endorphins, it also can look like dysthymia, which is low-grade depression. And so I also have some classes on that. And you might, those who have watched the free class that I do, I talk a little bit about that as well. But people who have a lot of endorphins, this is interesting, seem happier than others and easily get high on life. So that's the opposite. And I could have, maybe put more in there on the dysthymia, which is like dysphoria. Just not happy. So the opposite end of that is super happy. And so I guess using the no, if you feel like you're the opposite end of that, you could put no. If you end up having more of the dysthymia or dysphoria than euphoria. So euphoria is the happy. And then there's those of us who fluctuate up and down through those. So, and then E, I'm not very grounded, often have my head in the clouds. And so this would also fit where I was talking about the task negative person. So the task negative person tends to be super happy. And it was so interesting when I was doing some just anecdotal research on ADHD, I discovered there was a rating scale I used. So the teachers would rate students, and they had a question on there that asked if that child seemed happier than, how their happiness level related to other kids. And what I found was that kids with ADHD, the teachers very consistently rated them as seeming happier than other children. I thought that was so interesting. So people with ADHD tend to ride in this upper realm, kind of the opposite of dysthymia. They tend to look like hypomania. And hypomania is the low end of mania, where it's actually this really happy place to be. Most people want to get there. But many people fluctuate in a roller coaster with it, and people with ADHD tend to kind of stay there more. So I just think that's fascinating how, they have the both ends. But the problem with being in that state is F. I tend to overlook problems and avoid dealing with reality. So a lot of times they don't want to come down to earth and face situations or that type of thing. In a relationship, that can be a problem. The person could be lots of fun, to hang out with, but then when there's stuff to deal with, they don't want to deal with it. So there's a downside definitely to that. But looking at that, it's kind of interesting to see, if you're low or higher in those chemicals. And then dopamine is the last one we'll look at. So dopamine is a mix between what I found norepinephrine and endorphins. So there's a little bit of the stimulant going on, or quite a bit actually of the stimulant going on, but there's also a pleasure chemistry going on. So what I found is that people who are low in it will crave things that combine the two. Chocolate is actually a combination of endorphins and norepinephrine. It's a stimulant, and it's got the sugar in there too. So it's got, a little bit of the caffeine type stimulant in there, and it's got the sugar in there blended. So they're kind of a mix of the two. And cocaine is another chemical that combines a stimulant with a narcotic in the same package. So those tend to raise dopamine levels. But so do rushes of pleasure. So anything that's stimulating and tends to be pleasurable will be addictive. So sex is one of those things that could fit in there. And shopping even, like going, there's a lot of things actually that release dopamine. So anything that's really kind of like stimulating and pleasure oriented. And then B, I struggle with depression and boredom. So people who are low in dopamine tend to really, really despise boredom. They're miserable in their boredom and want, the dopamine's the opposite that stimulates it, that gives them that relief. And then with C, I wish I were happier. I wish I could escape reality. That could be someone who's low in dopamine as well. So other things that happen when people are low in dopamine, they tend to look a little bit like the person who's high in GABA. So they may be really low energy. And so looking back at that one, if the person had some of these that were yeses, you might correlate that a little bit with the dopamine to see if those are opposites as well. But too much dopamine, this is what's interesting, is people can have a certain stimulation of dopamine and it's just like a little burst and then it goes away. But there are some cases where people's dopamine levels stay high, and if that happens, we have some interesting things. So pretty bizarre thoughts and ideas. So they've actually found that people who are high in dopamine, a lot of times that's correlated with schizophrenia. So people who look really crazy, so to speak, a lot of times their dopamine doesn't come down. And it may not be full-blown schizophrenia. It could just be a little bizarre, a little eccentric, a little kind of out there with their ideas. And so that could be a high dopamine situation. It's hard to be inside my own skin at times. Sometimes when people have too much of that dopamine, it feels intense and like you just want to get away and you can't. And so a lot of times people will go into a real high energy pattern just to run from their own discomfort, I guess. And they might literally, have a lot of exercising or something like that just to try to cope. And then F, I have a tendency to flip out and lose it. So when that dopamine comes, up too high, it's sometimes like an overload. And so that's kind of how you'll see that. So this is an extreme chemical. And so it's going to be, even more extreme than just norepinephrine. And partly because, they actually found with people that use LSD that, LSD as a hallucinogen stimulates a lot of dopamine, in the brain and keeps it there because it's a 12-hour drug. That's a long time to have dopamine. And so that's partly why people are going into hallucinations and that type of thing. So anyway, so dopamine can be very addictive. I've actually looked at whether it's even necessary. I had an experience where I went on vacation and it was kind of like a dopamine world. It was just like we did all these intense fun things and it was as an escape from reality. And then the idea of coming back home and facing reality was not pleasant. And so, I look at sometimes you just want to stay in reality and deal with boredom, which is really the best thing you can do is study meditation and mindfulness training and just be present in your situation. And I found that more I do that, the more I like my life. I don't need dopamine. I'm just content with the present moment and reality is fine. I don't need to escape it. So there's some solutions in just, I always say mindfulness training, and I will talk more about that in some of the classes that talk about solutions for these chemicals. So this class is mainly just looking at where you're at, what's high, what's low. And then going forward, we look at, now that we know that, what do we do? What are the solutions? Natural solutions that are not potentially, as addictive or that could throw off brain chemistry further. So I look forward to continuing with that.